Professor Vextall strutted into advanced xenobiology, 401 like he owned the entire Arcturus Prime solar system, which, knowing his ego, he probably thought he did. Four purple eyes swept across the lecture hall with all the warmth of a tax audit, taking in his collection of the galaxy's most privileged students. "Greetings, my intellectually inferior yet moderately educable pupils," he announced, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that could pickle vegetables. The Zentaurian's tentacle-like fingers adjusted his ridiculous academic robes, because apparently looking like a pompous squid wasn't enough. He needed the outfit to match. In the front row, three crystalline glixens chimed in harmonious greeting, their translucent bodies refracting the classroom lights into little rainbows. Behind them, a cluster of squishlings gurgled appreciatively, their tentacles writhing in what passed for applause in their culture. The usual collection of galactic brown-nosers, really. But it was the figure in the back corner that should have caught Vextall's attention, should have, but didn't, because for all his academic credentials, the professor had the observational skills of a particularly dense asteroid. Jake Martinez sat quietly, looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else in the galaxy. He was taking notes in what appeared to be genuine interest, though if you looked closely, you might notice his handwriting looked suspiciously like he was making a grocery list. The human, though nobody in the room knew that particular detail yet, had the kind of unremarkable appearance that made him blend into backgrounds like camouflage. Today, Vextall continued, puffing out his chest sacs in what his species considered an impressive display, we shall embark upon a journey into the realm of the truly terrifying. We shall explore the darkest corners of our galaxy, where evolution has crafted creatures so deadly, so perfectly adapted for destruction, that their very existence challenges our understanding of biological possibility. The class leaned forward. This was why they'd signed up for advanced xenobiology. Well, that and the fact that it was required for their xenopsychology degrees. Ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary crystalline entities, Vextall's voice dropped to what he probably thought was a dramatic whisper. Today we study Deathworld predators. A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. The glixens chiming became discordant with excitement. The squishlings' tentacles knotted themselves in anticipation. Jake looked up from his definitely not a grocery list and blinked once. Then he went back to his notes, adding what looked suspiciously like milk, eggs, bread, to his academic observations. Vextall activated the holographic display with a theatrical flourish that would have made an opera singer jealous. The first image materialized in the center of the room, and the class collectively held its breath. "Behold," the professor intoned. "The razor-wing flutterbeast of Nexus 7. The hologram showed what could generously be described as a butterfly. A very pretty butterfly, actually, with wings that shimmered like stained glass and delicate antennae that swayed in an imaginary breeze. The only thing remotely threatening about it was that its wing edges looked slightly sharper than your average Earth butterfly. This aerial assassin," Vextall continued with the kind of dramatic intensity usually reserved for describing supernovas, "can slice through Nexus Shin bark cloth with a single wing beat. Its victims never see death coming, distracted as they are by its hypnotic beauty." The glixens chimed in terror. One of the squishlings actually wrapped its tentacles around itself in what appeared to be a self-hug of protection. Jake glanced up, looked at the hologram, then wrote something in his notebook. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed it looked like he was drawing a small smiley face. "But wait," Vextall said, "because apparently one deadly butterfly wasn't enough. There's more." The hologram shifted to reveal what looked like a purple salamander with an attitude problem. "The dreaded poison spitter of Gamma Centauri," Vextall announced, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow managed to be both hushed and pompous. "This vicious predator can project its toxic saliva up to 3 meters with deadly accuracy." "How deadly?" asked a brave glixen, its crystalline voice tinkling with morbid curiosity. "The poison causes," Vextall paused for maximum dramatic effect, "mild skin irritation and temporary purple discoloration." The class gasped as if he'd just described acid that could melt through starship hulls. Jake coughed, which might have been surprise or might have been him trying not to laugh, hard to tell. "And the discoloration," one of the squishlings gurgled. "How long does it last?" "Up to," another dramatic pause, 6 standard hours. The horror was palpable. Students were taking frantic notes, probably planning to write home about their brush with learning about such terrifying creatures. "Now," Vextall said, warming to his theme like a bad actor who'd finally found his audience, "let me tell you about the sonic screamer of Betelgeuse Minor." The hologram flickered to show what appeared to be a hamster with unusually large lungs. "This beast can produce sound waves reaching up to 90 decibels, Vextall declared. 90 decibels. The class was appropriately horrified. Jake looked up again, this time with what might have been genuine curiosity, and wrote something longer in his notebook. It looked suspiciously like he was calculating something, but surely that was just academic interest in the impressive statistics being presented. Professor Vextall was hitting his stride now, basking in the terrified attention of his students like a lizard under a heat lamp. He gestured grandly at the holographic display which cycled through images of increasingly ridiculous predators that looked like they'd been designed by a committee of overly cautious kindergartners. "Of course," he said, adjusting his robes with the air of someone about to drop serious academic knowledge, "we must address the elephant in the room." Jake's pen paused mid-sentence. A squishling in the third row raised a tentacle. "Professor, what's an elephant?" Vextall waved dismissively. "A figure of speech, you gelatinous simpleton. No, I refer to the so-called Deathworld that appears in some of our more creative xenobiological literature." He activated a new hologram, this one showing a blue and green marble suspended in space. It looked almost peaceful, really. Pretty, even. "Students, allow me to present the theoretical construct known as Earth." The way he said it, you'd think he was discussing unicorns or affordable textbooks. According to these clearly fictional accounts, Vextall continued, this impossible world supposedly harbors conditions so extreme, so utterly hostile to life, that the very idea of evolution producing sentient beings there is laughable. A crystalline hand shot up. "What makes it so dangerous, Professor?" "Oh, where do I begin?" Vextall chuckled. The sound like air escaping from a punctured balloon. "This imaginary planet supposedly has weather that changes. Not gradually, mind you, but sometimes within the span of a single rotation. Imagine storms that can level forests, frozen precipitation that falls from the sky, and temperature variations that can span over 100 degrees. The class shuddered collectively. Jake was now actively trying not to look interested, which paradoxically made him look more interested. "But surely," ventured a squishling, "no life could survive such chaos." "Precisely my point," Vextall exclaimed. "Yet the fiction continues. This theoretical world supposedly has an atmosphere composed largely of a highly corrosive gas called oxygen. Oxygen, a substance so reactive it literally burns things. And the theoretical inhabitants not only tolerate it, they require it for survival." "That's impossible," gasped a Glixen. "Indeed. And the gravity," Vextall was really warming up now, "supposedly 10 times stronger than our comfortable standard. It would crush the bones of any civilized species." Jake shifted in his seat, which might have been uncomfortable hearing about his home planet being described as a fictional hellscape, or might have been because the chairs in this lecture hall were really not designed for human proportions. "And the theoretical inhabitants," Vextall continued, building to what he clearly thought was the punchline. "These so-called humans are described as bipedal persistence hunters who evolved from pack predators. Can you imagine? Creatures that supposedly chase their prey until it collapses from exhaustion." "Barbaric," whispered a student. "Fictional," Vextall corrected firmly. "No species could be so perfectly adapted for violence and still develop civilization. The very concept contradicts everything we know about evolutionary biology." A brave squishling raised a tentacle. "But Professor, what if they're real? What if humans actually exist?" Vextall laughed, a sound like a deflating balloon having an asthma attack. "My dear gelatinous pupil, if such beings existed, they'd probably be tiny scavengers hiding in caves somewhere, cowering from the very environment that supposedly created them. The idea that they could develop space travel, let alone attend our prestigious university." He trailed off, suddenly noticing that Jake had stopped taking notes entirely and was staring at him with the kind of expression usually reserved for watching someone explain why the sky is actually plaid. "Is there something you'd like to add, Mr.?" Vextall squinted at his class roster. "Martinez." Jake looked like he'd rather be getting a root canal from a Betelgeeusian dentist. But he cleared his throat politely. "No sir, just taking notes." "Excellent," Vextall said, clearly pleased with his own brilliance. "Now then, to cement today's learning experience, I'm assigning each of you a research project. You will present on the most dangerous predator from your homeworld, focusing on evolutionary adaptations and hunting strategies." The class perked up with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for surprise pizza deliveries. A Glixen chimed up first. "Professor, I could discuss the shimmer moths of my homeworld. They're attracted to our natural luminescence and sometimes bump into us. It can be quite startling." "Terrifying," Vextall agreed solemnly. "And you Squishalin." The Squishaling gurgled proudly. "The harmony crystals of Gloop Prime actually sing back when we vocalize. Sometimes their pitch is slightly off-key. It disrupts our meditation cycles. Horrific. Absolutely horrific." Vextall was practically taking notes himself. "What about you, young Zephyr?" A small flowery being rustled its petals nervously. Well, on my world we have these creatures called nibble roots. They eat the tips of our smaller branches while we're photosynthesizing. We don't usually notice until later. The class gasped. Unauthorized pruning was apparently the stuff of nightmares. Magnificent examples, all, Vexel declared. The galaxy's predator-prey relationships never cease to amaze with their intensity. Jake was scribbling in his notebook again, but this time it looked less like grocery lists and more like he was writing what appeared to be an obituary. For his own sanity, probably. Now then, Vexel's 4 eyes swept the room like searchlights looking for trouble. Who else would like to volunteer? Don't be shy. Academic excellence requires courage in the face of terrifying biological realities. The room fell silent. Students examined their tentacles, crystalline structures and various appendages with sudden fascination. Come now, Vexel pressed. Surely someone has encountered predatory behavior on their homeworld. More silence. You could have heard a photon drop. Mr. Martinez. Vexel's voice carried the kind of authority that could make registration deadlines seem reasonable. You've been unusually quiet. Surely your homeworld has some form of predatory species. Jake looked up with the expression of someone who'd just been asked to explain quantum physics to a houseplant. Well, Professor, that's kind of a complicated question. Nonsense. Every world has its food chain. What's the apex predator where you're from? Jake sighed, the sound carrying the weight of someone about to ruin everyone's day. Okay, but you asked for it. Let's start small. He stood up, which immediately made him the tallest thing in the room by a considerable margin. The other students had to crane their various sensory organs upward. On my homeworld, we have these small carnivorous mammals called cats. They're about this big. Jake held his hands apart to indicate something roughly the size of a small backpack, and they kill approximately 2 billion birds per year. Each cat averages about 1,000 kills annually. But that's not the interesting part. The class was silent, not the good kind of silent, but the kind of silent that happens right before someone screams. The interesting part, Jake continued in the same conversational tone you might use to discuss the weather, is that they don't kill for food. They kill for fun. We call it recreational murder, and we keep them in our homes as companions. A squishling made a sound like air being slowly released from a very terrified balloon. They also play with their prey before killing it, Jake added helpfully. You know, to practice their technique. One of the Glixens began chiming in what sounded like a panic chord. But those are just the small ones, Jake continued, apparently not noticing that his audience was having collective cardiac events. We also have pack hunters called wolves. They can run for hours without stopping, coordinate complex hunting strategies, and take down prey 50 times their individual body weight through teamwork and persistence. Professor Vexel had gone a shade of purple that suggested his circulatory system was having philosophical disagreements with his nervous system. Then there are the aquatic predators, Jake said, warming to his topic in the way that people do when they finally get to talk about their interests. Sharks, for instance, have been around for 400 million years essentially unchanged because they achieved evolutionary perfection as killing machines. They can smell a drop of blood in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. What's an Olympic-sized swimming pool? Whispered a student. About 25 million drops of water, Jake replied matter-of-factly. Anyway, sharks have multiple rows of replacement teeth, electromagnetic sensors that can detect heartbeats, and some species never stop moving, or they'll die. The classroom had achieved the kind of silence usually associated with funeral parlors and tax audits. And bears, Jake continued, apparently mistaking terrified silence for rapt attention, are omnivorous land predators that can run 40 miles per hour, climb trees, swim, have a sense of smell 7 times better than a bloodhound, and can break a moose's spine with a single swipe. What's a moose? Someone managed to squeak. Picture a horse with antlers the size of small trees and an attitude problem, Jake said. Bears hunt them for snacks. Professor Vexel attempted to speak, made a sound like a broken vocalizer, and tried again. Mr. Martinez, these descriptions are quite creative, but surely you're exaggerating for dramatic effect. Jake looked genuinely confused. Exaggerating? Professor, I haven't even mentioned the oceanic apex predators, the aerial hunters, or the microscopic parasites yet. Oh, or the plants. Plants. The word came out as a collective whimper. Some of them eat animals. Jake explained cheerfully. Venus flytraps, pitcher plants, sundews. We think they're pretty neat, actually. Some people keep them as hobbies. The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a noise-canceling device. The silence stretched on like a particularly awkward family dinner, until finally, a brave squishling raised a trembling tentacle. "Mr. Martinez," it gurgled. "You seem to know an awful lot of specific details about these theoretical predators." Jake paused, his pen hovering over his notebook like a sword over a surrender document. "Well, I mean, I did my research pretty thoroughly." "What kind of research?" Professor Vextal had managed to find his voice, though it sounded like it had been through a blender. "These descriptions are incredibly detailed. Almost like you've observed these creatures firsthand." Jake looked around the room at the sea of terrified faces, crystalline structures, and quivering tentacles. "That's a very perceptive observation, Professor. So where exactly did you get this information?" Pressed a Glixen, its chiming voice cracking with what might have been curiosity or impending hysteria. Jake set down his pen and looked at his hands for a long moment, like he was trying to decide whether to jump off a cliff or just relocate to another galaxy. "Okay, look, I was really hoping to get through this semester without having this conversation." "What conversation?" Vextal's voice had climbed several octaves into what could generously be called the soprano range. "The one where I explain that Earth isn't actually a theoretical construct." Jake's voice was still conversational, like he was mentioning that it might rain later. "It's my homeworld." The classroom achieved a level of silence that physicists would have found fascinating. It was the kind of quiet that made you wonder if sound itself had packed up and left for somewhere less awkward. "Your homeworld," Vextal repeated slowly, like he was trying to parse a sentence written in a language that consisted entirely of mathematical equations. "Yeah," Jake confirmed. "Born and raised in a place called Colorado. Nice mountains, decent skiing, occasional bear encounters. Pretty standard stuff." A squishling made a sound like a balloon being slowly strangled. "Bear encounters are standard." "Well, not daily," Jake said reassuringly, which somehow made it worse. "Maybe once or twice a year if you're hiking in the right areas. They're usually more afraid of you than you are of them." "Usually." The word came out as a collective squeak. "Look, 99% of the time, bears just want to be left alone," Jake explained with the patience of someone who'd clearly had this conversation before. "It's the other 1% you have to worry about." Professor Vextal was now making a sound like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. "You're saying that you're actually a human." "Last time I checked," Jake confirmed. "Though I suppose the university's medical center could run some tests if you want to be sure." "But that's impossible." Vextal's 4 eyes were blinking in what appeared to be a random pattern. "Humans are theoretical, they're a thought experiment about evolutionary impossibility." "That's actually kind of offensive," Jake said mildly. "I mean, I'm sitting right here, I've been taking notes all semester. I turned in my essay on comparative respiratory systems last week. The one about oxygen-based metabolisms," Vextal whispered, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd just realized they'd been lecturing a tiger about how mythical tigers were. "Yeah, that one. I got an A- by the way. Thanks for the feedback about citation format." A student in the front row raised a shaky appendage. "But Professor Vextal said humans were persistence hunters, pack predators, apex predators." Jake looked genuinely confused. "Well, yeah, I mean that's basically accurate. We did evolve as endurance hunters. That's why we sweat instead of panting, and why we have these long legs and weird feet." "Weird feet," someone whispered. "Compared to most species, yeah." Jake lifted one foot slightly. "Optimized for long-distance running on varied terrain. We can literally run prey to death across multiple climate zones." The classroom temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "But you seem so," a Glixen chimed hesitantly. "So peaceful." Jake blinked. "I am peaceful. I'm actually vegetarian." This revelation caused more panic than the predator descriptions had. "Vegetarian." Vextal's voice cracked completely. "You mean you've rejected your predatory nature?" "I wouldn't say rejected," Jake said thoughtfully. "More like, chose a different path. Plenty of humans are vegetarian. It's not that weird. But if you're a persistence hunter who doesn't hunt," a squishling gurgled in confusion, "what do you do with your predatory instincts?" Jake considered this. "I play video games. Mostly. Sometimes I go rock climbing. Oh, and I'm on the university's track team." "Track team. Competitive running," Jake explained. "You know, chase things that aren't actually prey. It's fun." "Fun." Vextal repeated the word like it was a foreign concept. Which, given the context, it probably was. "Look," Jake said, clearly trying to be helpful. I know this is a lot to process, but I'm really not dangerous. I mean, I've been sitting in this classroom for 3 months and nobody got hurt. Nobody got hurt, echoed a student. Right. See, perfectly safe. Jake smiled, which was probably supposed to be reassuring but had the effect of revealing his teeth. Human teeth. Omnivore teeth designed for tearing and grinding. The effect was immediate and dramatic. It was like watching a nature documentary about gazelles suddenly realizing they were having lunch with a lion. Oh come on, Jake said, noticing the renewed panic. They're not even that sharp. You should see a shark's teeth. Now those are impressive. Someone in the back of the room made a sound like a squeaky toy being slowly deflated. That's when the campus security alarm started going off. The security alarm was playing the universal tune of something has gone terribly wrong, and everyone should probably panic now, which really wasn't helping the situation. Through the classroom windows, Jake could see campus security vehicles approaching at what could generously be described as a cautious distance. Very cautious, like maybe they were planning to handle this situation with a really long stick. Did someone call security? Jake asked, looking genuinely puzzled. Standard protocol, squeaked a Glixen, when a Deathworld predator is identified in a civilian area. I'm not a Deathworld predator, Jake protested. I'm a student. I have a meal plan and everything. This did not seem to reassure anyone. Professor Vextel had managed to back himself against the far wall, clutching his lecture notes like they might serve as some form of protective barrier. Mr. Martinez, he said in the tone of someone trying to negotiate with a natural disaster. Perhaps you could remain very still while we sort this out. I've been sitting still for the entire semester, Jake pointed out reasonably. It hasn't been a problem before. That was before we knew what you were, whispered a squishling. I'm the same person I was 5 minutes ago, Jake said, starting to sound a little exasperated. Nothing about me has actually changed except your perception. Through the window they could see the security team setting up what appeared to be some kind of perimeter, with really big barriers, and what looked suspiciously like tranquilizer equipment designed for something considerably larger than Jake. Are they seriously planning to tranquilize me? Jake asked, peering out the window with the kind of interest usually reserved for watching particularly unusual weather patterns. It's for everyone's safety, Vextel managed. Whose safety? I'm not doing anything dangerous. I'm literally just standing here having a conversation, a Glixen chimed nervously. But you could do something dangerous. Theoretically. Jake stared at the crystalline being for a long moment. I could theoretically do a lot of things. I could theoretically perform interpretive dance. That doesn't mean I'm going to. Interpretive dance isn't lethal, pointed out a squishling. Have you seen bad interpretive dance? Jake asked. Because I'd argue that point. The security team had apparently decided that their current distance was insufficient and had moved to what appeared to be the next parking lot over. They were now so far away that they probably needed telescopes to see the classroom. This is ridiculous, Jake muttered, pulling out his communication device. I'm calling the dean. The collective intake of breath from the class sounded like a small hurricane. You have the dean's personal contact information. Vextel's voice climbed several more octaves into ranges that were probably only audible to certain types of crystals. Well yeah, Jake said, scrolling through his contacts. She's my academic advisor. Professor Cathara has been helping me with my xenosociology thesis. The silence that followed this revelation could have been used as a foundation for building more silence on top of. Your thesis, someone managed to whisper. Integration strategies for biologically diverse species in academic environments, Jake recited. Turns out I'm gathering a lot of really good primary source material today. And that's when Professor Vextel fainted. Just straight up collapsed like a balloon that had encountered a particularly sharp concept. 3 days later, Jake found himself in the unusual position of being the university's most famous and most avoided student simultaneously. The dean had sorted out the security situation, mostly by laughing until she cried and then assigning Jake a work-study position in the xenobiology department as a living cultural exchange resource. Professor Vextel had recovered from his fainting spell but now taught his classes from behind a transparent aluminum barrier. He insisted it was for observational purposes. And definitely not because he was terrified of his own student. The fact that he'd requested the barrier be rated for Class 5 predatory encounters was purely coincidental. The advanced xenobiology class had become the most popular course on campus, with students from across the galaxy auditing just to see the actual Deathworld predator in his natural habitat of taking notes and occasionally asking questions about assignment due dates. Jake had tried to make everyone more comfortable by bringing in photos of his family's pets. This backfired spectacularly when he showed them a picture of his sister's golden retriever, Max, who was apparently the most terrifying creature most of the students had ever seen. He's bred for retrieving waterfowl, Jake had explained helpfully. His mouth is specifically designed to carry things gently without damaging them. Gently. A squishling had repeated faintly. Right. So he can bring back prey without breaking it. The fact that humans had specifically engineered other species to be better at hunting had somehow made everything worse. By the end of the semester, Jake had inadvertently become the university's unofficial consultant on theoretical Deathworld biology, which was really just him explaining normal Earth stuff to increasingly horrified alien academics. He'd also started dating a Zentorian linguistics student named Zara, who found his casual relationship with mortality fascinating rather than terrifying. Their first date had been a disaster when Jake mentioned that humans sometimes jumped out of perfectly functional aircraft for entertainment, but the second date went better after he explained that skydiving was optional. The real breakthrough came when Jake brought his emotional support goldfish Neptune to campus for the new semester. The sight of a human caring for another species, even one as simple as a goldfish, had somehow convinced everyone that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't planning to hunt them all down for sport. "It's just a fish," Jake had explained to the crowd of fascinated xenobiologists who'd gathered to observe this miraculous display of interspecies cooperation. "But you feed it," Professor Vextel had said, his voice filled with wonder. "You provide for its needs without consuming it." "Well, yeah," Jake had replied. "That's what caring for something means." And that's when the entire university finally understood the cosmic joke. Humans weren't monsters despite being apex predators. They were apex predators who'd learned to be something more. They were the species that had climbed to the top of the food chain and then decided to build a civilization anyway. They were dangerous not because they were predators, but because they were predators who'd chosen to be caretakers instead. Jake never did figure out why that made everyone cry, but he'd learned to keep tissues handy during his presentations. After all, that's what humans did. They adapted. Even to college.